The air reeked of swamp rot and concrete dust as I stood along what had been my backyard, watching Karen from the HOA screaming at a city inspector, while her 800 pre-zero McMansion crept its way 1 inch further into the muck. Flash flood alerts flashed on stalled squad cars, frogs croaked off front yards, and somewhere off, beyond the swampy hellscape, a rusty mailbox floated by funeral float. Yep, that's me. You're probably wondering how we got here. I never thought a skinny little creek winding through my backyard would become a call to arms, but that's exactly what transpired for years. That trickle of water was my escape, my reward after long days welding pipes and crawling under houses for a living. I would sit in an old folding chair next to the creek, beer in one hand and rod in the other, though I never caught anything bigger than a curious bluegill. Dragonflies buzzed through the tall reeds, the air smelled like wet grass, and the only sound at night was the soft burble of water winding through the rocks. It was the kind of peace you did not mess with. Then came the HOA. In reality, the HOA had for years been on the other side of the subdivision, all ensconced in their very same beige homes with their similarly colored mailboxes and curiously synchronized porch gourds. Every October, we Creekside people were the old-timers, the remnants from when this was just fields and country roads, but borders were redrawn, neighborhoods annexed, and before we could even blink, the HOA had insinuated itself into our lives like an oil spill. I received my first taste of their nonsense when a woman named Karen Mitchell showed up on my porch one hot Saturday morning, clipboard clutched to her chest like a medieval shield. She was dressed in pastel workout gear, despite clearly not panning out, and her smile was as warm as a tax audit. She said she was the HOA Community Standards Chair, and I said I was busy. But that did not deter her. She had issues with my property. More specifically, she had issues with my creek. In her opinion, it was an unauthorized water feature that was a serious safety risk to neighborhood kids and wildlife. I glared at her like she had accused my cat of running a Ponzi scheme. The creek was a natural, had been around much longer than all of us, came along with our mortgages and zero-turn mowers. It was part of the scenery as much as the rocks and trees. Karen did not care. Karen had rules. Rules about fencing, water, features, rules about standing, water rules about aesthetics, rules. I attempted to nicely explain to her that the creek was a protected natural drainage on my deed and county code, but she merely angrily wrote something on her clipboard and stormed off with the smell of designer perfume and raw anger still in the air. 2 days later, I got my first notice of violation taped to my door with blue painter's tape. It served me with an unauthorized landscape element. Notice unsafe open water and is a magnet for non-native species, because allegedly now frogs are also foreign invaders. I ignored it. A week later, received a second notice, this time stating fines of $100 per day. If I didn't come up with a plan to get my property into compliance, I wrote them a straight letter referencing county codes and sent them a copy of the land survey showing $100 per day unless I can. Tom, the status of the creek, they returned and reserved a compulsory inspection. That inspection consisted of 3 people whom I had not seen previously patrolling my backyard with tape measures and smartphones snapping pictures like they were gathering evidence to arrest me for war crime. Karen oversaw from the border my property, tapping her toes impatiently as I stood there, arms crossed, daring them to step 1 inch into the creek itself. They did not, but they made lots of notes a week later at the required HOA meeting that I had absolutely no intention of attending. Until then, Karen stood up in front of the crowd of largely disinterested neighbors and declared my creek an imminent danger risk. She mentioned insurance risk, wildlife attract, mosquito breeding, and potential future erosion, endangering nearby property. The irony of labeling a natural creek a danger when living in proximity to a swampy marsh was apparently lost on her. When I protested, she smiled graciously and offered me a pile of paperwork, asking me to fence the entire creek, fill it in, or allow bi-weekly HOA inspections on the rest of the year. At my expense, I explained to her her and the entire room where she could neatly place her paperwork afterward. Things went south. I started getting anonymous complaints about my overgrown landscaping and failure to maintain property standards on my door. My mailbox was somehow knocked off the post one morning. Someone filled a dump truckload of landscaping rocks into the creek's shallow end, making it build up a little and strain the bank. I did catch Karen herself one afternoon, photographing my lawn from behind her SUV parked on the street, with the engine running around like a suburban detective type. I refused to budge. I left the creek natural, left the reeds intact, left the flow unobstructed. It was my land, my water, and my God, given right to sit beside it in peace. I should have known they would leave me alone at that. It did happen early. One Wednesday morning I was sipping my coffee on the back porch when I also heard the deep rumbling of equipment. First, I believed it was the city workers fixing the pothole on Maple Drive, but the sound came much nearer. I got up just in time to spot a small cement truck slowly backing down the side alleyway between my home and the one next door. A guy in a neon vest and hard hat was hauling it like he was parking a Ferrari, screaming in the driver through the engine rump. They ran down the steps and over the lawn as they moved the chute over top of the last bend of my creek. "Hey!" I yelled, waving my arm. "What in the devil's name do you think you're doing?" The vest fellow hardly glanced in my direction. "Just following work orders, sir. Drainage mitigation project, authorized by HOA." Before I could get another word out, the chute descended, and a gloopy gray slurry of wet cement began pouring down into creek. I lost it. I pushed on, but slipped in muddy grass and fell hard on side-scraped arm before I crawled back to feet. The cement was spreading already like toxic ooze over the pebbles, smothering the reeds, strangling the water itself. Frogs leaped wildly away from the flow, but some were too slow, trapped in the sticky mess. As it hardened, driver kept the drums rolling aimlessly, filling the entire upper bend with heavy gray sludge. While the vest guy examined the clipboard and indicated in agreement, I screamed at them to leave to offer me forms to vacate my property, but they just disregarded me when they were finished and took off. My lovely creek had become a hideous concrete gash, a silent, lifeless ditch that stretched from the side of the yard to the other. A simmering anger came into my bones as I stood there, mud and blood smeared on my face, staring in horror at the blaze that had consumed what was once the center of my home. Karen watched from the sidewalk, arms crossed, smiling as if she had just made her advance on a chessboard. She believed I didn't even know we were playing. I wiped the mud from my eye, stood erect, and smiled back at her. Let her have this round. She knew what kind of storm she had just let loose. The first rain was almost a blessing. Following the summer, we had a solid sheet of gray blowing in off the west and wetting the dry streets of our neighborhood down with a soothing deluge of cool water. I sat on my porch and saw it come, arms crossed, coffee getting cold in my hand. Thick drops pounded the roof and made the lawn a sponge of mud. The creek would have done it grudgingly, its little gurgling mouth devouring the runoff and carrying it downstream, as it had done for more time than any of us had lived around here. But today, there was no creek to catch, only a long, hard scar of concrete, and smooth and pointless. I stood there and watched the water splash off the concrete channel, swirl uncertainly, and then begin to back up, drawing across the lawn and into the low spots like an old man struggling to remember his way home. In an hour, puddles lay out across my backyard like unsightly gray bruises. By noon, the sidewalk out front was ankle deeply in cloudy runoff mulch and trash, spinning slowly in circles where the storm drains clogged on the street. Karen Mitchell waited on her porch with an umbrella the size of a beach tent as she watched, thin-lipped and satisfied, as water inched up the curbs and flower beds. It only took 2 storms before the first real issue to gaze. Mrs. Jensen of the corner residence woke up to find that her basement carpet was squishing under her feet. Mr. Beast recalled and swore 8 at 4. Org Alvarez had to sandbag his front door when a river of runoff ran down the slope of his yard straight toward his porch. The gutters on Maple Drive clogged so badly that the whole cul-de-sac turned into a stagnant pool, engulfing 2 unlucky cars up to their wheel wells in filthy brown stew. And every single time the HOA sent out a notice blaming the homeowner's improper lawn grading, clogged individual drain, failure to maintain property, water runoff in accordance with HOA regulation, it was never their fault. Not once spoke Karen or her friends the fact that by infilling the natural run with concrete, they had disabled the entire runoff system It was as if the creek had never existed, erased from memory, the way you'd erase a guilty footprint on a crime scene. I said nothing in public. I attended the groups, nodded compliantly when they showed satellite images with red markers on areas of concern, seen as they passed through new emergency measures that included compulsory property drainage inspection, which incidentally cost $250 per resident. I played fool in there. I documented every storm. I surveyed the block with my trusty old Nikon camera over my neck, pretending to be amateur shooter while taking hundreds of photos. Flooded yards, drowned mailboxes, water collecting along the newly landscaped common spaces. I kept a book too full of time, dates, places, and comments as to which homes were hit. Worst, I even started flying my retired drone after the bigger storm, taking aerial shots of the way that the water was moving, or in this case, wasn't moving. Nobody cared. They had too much other stuff to deal with. Because as the water problems escalated, so did the tension between neighbors. Mrs. Jensen complained that Alvarez children had clogged the storm drain with a soccer ball. Hendersons accused Patels of installing a new flower bed that supposedly caused runoff onto their land. People who used to share beers and barbecue recipes now made formal complaints against each other for willful mismanagement of water. The HOA naturally leaned into it. They tasked Karen with a new task force on flood mitigation that essentially just seemed to be her writing more and more pugnacious violation letters and bulldozing through emergency fines without any vote, while the actual drainage infrastructure literally broke down from overuse. The few storm drains we did have were never built to handle full runoff of our area without the natural creek doing what it was supposed to do, and they were drowned under the load of the storm like a person trying to breathe through a straw. The sidewalks, cracked lawns were swept away, mold inched up the side of garage doors, and somehow the blame was always on the doorsteps of the people. I heard one grumbling neighbor bitterly at the mailbox one morning that maybe Karen should find herself for not having the ability to control the weather. The sarcasm was getting thicker than the floodwater. I kept quiet, simply nodded sympathetically, and filed away another set of printed pictures in my burgeoning evidence file. It was not only the water which was on the increase, it was resentment, thick and crass tension, building beneath the surface of our tidy neighborhood, like steam seeping under a cracked kettle lid. You could feel it in the way that people avoided other people's eyes at HOA meeting, in the way hushed conversations ceased when board members of some standing walked by. And Karen? Well, Karen seemed to thrive on it. She strutted around wearing her HOA badge like a sheriff's star, relishing every new complaint, every new fine levied on houses that did not agree with her. She even showed up at my doorstep one afternoon, insincere smiling and informing me that due to ongoing drainage issues, I had to submit a full landscaping plan for approval. At the end of the month, I asked if the plan was to include provision for the actual wall of concrete which they had dumped in my property without my permission, but she slowly blinked and informed me that any alterations to the drainage structures which were already in place were to be subject to extra fine. I signed the papers with a smile, took her official appearing shape, and stored it in my burgeoning binder of bullets. Let them dig their own graves. I was waiting patiently. I had the time, and I knew something that they did not. Nature does not forget. Water does not forgive, and concrete, no matter all its condescending permanence, cannot keep standing forever in the face of the simple, inescapable persistence of rain and gravity. It would not take long now. The cracks were already starting to form. If you cared to look, I saw it in the slow but sure failure of Mr. Alvarez's retaining wall, in the spreading puddle, which never really did dry at the end of the Hendersons' driveway, in the way Mrs. Jensen's front lawn appeared to be suspiciously tipping towards the street after the previous big storm. The ground was tilting unobtrusively, at first like a cat settling its weight before a leap, but going the whole thing, all because they had tried to pave over something that was never meant to be controlled. I kept my head down, kept my mouth shut, kept my camera batteries charged, because it was not just me they had wronged anymore, it was us all. And when the dam finally broke, I would have a front row seat. The third week of rain started like a drum roll, quietly at first, barely a whisper on the window panes, and then it built up into a full-throated bellow that darkened the sky and filled the air with the scent of wet earth and ozone. The weather reports rolled alerts on every channel calling it a 100-year storm, a freak convergence of cold fronts and wet ground. But out here in the hood, it just looked like Judgment Day. The streets ran like rivers overnight, overnight, asphalt gobbled up by churning gray water studded with shreds of sod and shattered mulch. Manhole covers belched brown geysers into air gutters ripped off from house side with metallic creak, the water too much for the framing to hold. Lawns sucked underneath grimy lakes that glimmered under streetlight like glass and oil, and the houses, God help them. The houses began cracking. It began small hairline cracks spreading out along driveway and walkways, easily ignored if you looked away or chalked it up to settle it. But then the real damage began. Long, jagged cracks climbing up stucco walls like lightning scars, door frames warping until front doors wouldn't catch garage floors, buckling as the earth below them shifted inside. I watched it all happen from my porch. The same folding chair, same beat-up thermos of coffee. A silent sentry witness as nature reclaimed what was rightfully it. Across the street, Karen Mitchell splashed in ankle-deep water, shrieking into her cell phone, flailing her arms at the lake that had swept away her prize-winning rosebush and now lapped at steps of her front porch. Her little suburban utopia was unraveling into a swamp, and she couldn't stop. She tried, of course. The HOA came scrambling like a kicked anthill, loading up hastily called emergency meetings at the community center, handing out sandbags from the bed of a rented U-Haul, sending blame-ridden email quoting everything clogged city drains to uncommonly high tide. They hired a landscaping company that did hasty water cleanup, which consisted mostly of dumping gravel into the worst puddles and wishing for the best. Karen herself spearheaded a campaign of blame against the city for lack of responsibility, filing complaints, threatening to sue, ranting about how their tax money entitled them to improved drainage system. But the truth hung in the air, heavy and unspoken, because anyone with eyes could look where it all started. It started where the creek once flowed. It started in my yard. And so therefore, the blame was placed elsewhere. First, there was rumor among HOA board members at emergency meeting. Then it came out in passive-aggressive email to all residents. Finally, Karen made it official, striding up onto my porch one day with a clipboard and a notice of violation that seemed to be about as thick as a phone book. Negligent maintenance of property, improper installation of drainage structures that had led to neighborhood flooding. Her voice trembling with barely controlled rage as she recited the charges, her voice echoing with wetness from the hem of her designer raincoat. I stood patiently sipping my coffee, nodding at all the appropriate time in order to unleash all of her anger and fear and frustration. I signed nothing. I said barely a word. I just smiled. That slow smile that made her eyes wrinkle with suspicion, because I knew something she did not. I had known it for weeks now, sitting quietly on the knowledge like a trapdoor spider, waiting for the right moment. They thought they had bulldozed the creek with some yards of concrete and a load of paperwork. But creeks, actual creeks, are ancient things. They are engraved into the very marrow of the earth, scored deeper than any human chart or HOAD. The water hadn't disappeared. It had just gone beneath, seeping through the ground, tracing its ancient roots, seeping into the ground layer by layer, until it was impossible to ignore. The foundations were cracking, not because of stopped-up drains nor rain. Individually, they were cracking because the ground itself was heaving, swollen with water trapped, straining against unnatural barriers that humans had insanely constructed. And I had proof. Buried in my files were the drone photos of the initial miner pooling the aerial maps showing the gradual, inescapable migration of the water towards the low-lying houses. The city flood plain maps never updated since the HOA's illegal creek alteration. Even some private silent conversations I had documented with contractors and surveyors who attested off the record that the alterations undertaken by the HOA were violating multiple county drainage codes, but I was not prepared to spring the trap. Yet no, this had to be worse. It had to hurt. It had to shatter them. And looking at the rising tension in the neighborhood, we were nearly there. You could sense it, like the heavy electric buzz before a thunderstorm, in the way neighbors glared at one another over waterlogged sidewalks, in the way voices escalated sharp and angry at HOA meeting, the way the once spotless lawns now sagged in the mud, and anger. Karen felt it too. She doubled down on enforcement. New rule, new fine, new inspection. She created a neighborhood improvement committee tasked with locating houses that were making the community's aesthetic worse. And guess whose name was at the head of that list? I smiled when the warning arrived. 3 pages of meandering accusations and masked threats. I pinned it to my growing binder, ensuring to stick a copy within the waterproof pouch I had seated in the center of the underbrush near the base of the old oak tree out back, in case, because individuals like Karen, once they knew the ground was shifting beneath them, were likely to get desperate. And desperate people made grand mistakes. All I had to do was stand back patiently, and the earth itself would take care of it. It already was. You could see it in the leaning frames of once proud doorways alleyways, the stooped fences, the broken retaining walls. You could hear it in the anxious murmurs outside the coffee shop, the whispers out at the mailboxes, the not-so-covert for-sale signs appearing quicker than mushrooms in a storm. The community was decaying from the inside out, just as Karen's paper kingdom of rules and regulation, and yet somehow she believed she could repair it by locating me into submission. She believed this was all about me. That was her downfall. This was not about me. It was about the land, about the water, about forces older and stronger and infinitely more patient than she would ever be able to understand. And very soon, she was going to find out about that lesson the hard way. The heavy envelope had lain at the bottom of my filing cabinet for years, wedged between yellowed manuals and a cracked box of Christmas lights that I never strung. I'd found it the night after Karen dropped the latest transgression note on my front door, her self-satisfied smile still in my thought. It had been simple obstinacy that had driven me out into the garage that evening, flashlight stuck between my teeth, searching through dusty ancient boxes until I found the creased blue folder that my grandfather had given me when he relinquished the property. Maybe useful someday, he explained, and then refused to explain. I opened the envelope with a screwdriver and found a treasure inside original land surveys dating back to 1952, a certified letter from the County Water Authority dated 1978, announcing a permanent natural drainage easement cutting through what was now my yard. Copy of state protection orders for environmental state, recognizing the creek to be a part of a protected watershed. In other words, hard official proof that my little creek was more than a mere pretty thing, but a legally protected drainage court, one that no homeowners association, however drunk on power, had a right to fill, block, reroute, or otherwise play with. And that is exactly what they had done when they poured it full of concrete. I sat back on the frigid concrete floor, the documents spread out like a hand of winning cards, and let out a slow, deep breath. They had blown it big time, but establishing it would take more than waving these papers around at the next HOA meet. I needed the right people to look at them. People in badges, people with clipboard, ones who might shut Karen down like a dam shuts off a river. So I phoned first to the County Water Authority, requesting them to come on out for a property inspection due to suspected unauthorized modification of natural drainage patterns. Second, I phoned the City Environmental Office, presenting it as an issue of suspected wetland violation. I used my provided name, submitted my true property data, but avoided mentioning the HOA. For now, let them discover the smoking gun themselves. While wheels of bureaucracy began to turn, I began drafting phase 2 of my strategy. Anonymous whistleblowing. It was unexpectedly simple. A burner email account. A well-worded message detailing the facts, complete with aerial drone shots, dated photos of the concrete pour copies of the original easement documents, and county code violation citation. I sent it to all the local TV stations, the city paper, some popular suburban Facebook groups, and just for kicks, the HOA rumor forum Karen had forbidden me from a year ago. Then I waited. I didn't have to wait long. 3 days after that, a white county truck inched down my street, led by a second vehicle bearing the city seal. 2 inspectors stepped out, one with a clipboard, the other with what looked like a surveyor's tripod. They pushed across the muddy sidewalk, gingerly avoiding the flooded yards, and came up to my front door. I invited them in, offered them coffee, and laid out the entire history in measured, calm tone. Backed by hard evidence, they visited, asked some pointed questions, and spent the next 4 hours meticulously probing the creek bed, measuring the concrete fill, collecting samples of soil, and snapping photos from every angle. I sat on my porch as they made notes, conferred in low tone, furrowed brows a lot, and finally shook their heads grimly before leaving in their truck. Later in the evening, the first news story hit. It was a short report on the evening news, a blurry overhead shot of our subdivision floating on a lake of muddy water as the newscaster explained how illegal modifications of natural drainage routes exacerbated the flooding and probably violated several environmental protections. They did not say anything about the HOA yet, but it was only a matter of time. The next morning, I got a certified letter stuffed into my mailbox, official notice of investigation. It was directed at the HOA, but of course, Karen already knew. The way she stormed into the emergency board meeting that afternoon told me everything. I stayed just long enough to see her march up to the podium, cheeks flushed, hair frizzed from the rain, and slam pile of papers on the floor in front of shell-shock board members. She ranted about slander regarding unfounded accusations about rogue residents destabilizing the community. She accused accused the county of abuse, the city of corruption, the media of bias. She accused them all but herself. In the meantime, at the back of her projector screen came alive, showing pictures that had clearly been photocopied out of the whistleblower packet. Photos of the cement truck spilling onto my creek, maps of the natural easement going straight through my land, captures of the county codes they had violated in bright red letters bold. The room grew quiet, except for the gentle hum of the air conditioner. Even the board members, who stood usually willing to nod along with Karen's every word, shifted awkwardly in their seat, eyes flying to each other, to the floor. Anywhere else but at her, she was stuck, and she knew it. But Karen was nothing if not stubborn. She doubled down, claimed the concrete was a temporary erosion control step, held that the HOA had the right to beautify common area, even hypothesized that she had the oral approval of someone in the county to do repairs. But when one of the more introverted board members asked hesitantly for written proof, Karen's mouth shut tighter than a steel trap, because there was none, and she knew it that night. The second wave of media attention hit this time. Much tougher words, such as illegal, reckless, and potential civil and criminal penalties, were thrown around with abandon. A number of residents were interviewed, some on camera, expressing their outrage, their concern about property value, their concern about mold and structural damage. A local taxpayer watchdog group smelled blood and started circulating a petition demanding a full investigation and damages paid to affected homeowners within a week. Official violation notices were posted on the doors of the town community center. City inspectors began knocking on doors, not to authorize HOA fines, but to enforce property inspections of flooding, and lawsuit of integrity began festering in the undercurrents. Rumors circulated as wildfire that many homeowners would file lawsuits against the HOA and certain individual board members for property negligence and damage. And at center stage was Karen, and in her position, tooth and nail battling to shut down leaks on a ship which was half submerged underwater. She tried to rally her diehards, the handful of diehard rule loyalists who still believed in the nobility of HOA rule, but whose numbers dwindled with every damp basement and broken wall. She tried to spin the victimhood tale, accusing conspiracies, but nobody was swallowing it any longer. The neighbors who once nodded in agreement to her diatribes now crossed the street to avoid her. The board meetings, once full of ill offense, now barely managed to summon a quorum. Her kingdom was unraveling, and she had no idea how to stop it. I sat watching it all happen from my porch, sipping my coffee, flipping through the growing stack of news articles and legal notices with quiet satisfaction, because Karen might have had the HOA in a chokehold at one time, but now the county, the city, the news, and the law had her by the ankles, yanking her down 1 inch at a time. She had built her empire on arrogance and asphalt, poured her phony confidence into concrete, and in the process she had forgotten the most basic rule of all: nature always prevail, and this time it was going to win in dazzling fashion. The first batch of city citations arrived like a thunderclap, thick envelopes full of each HOA board member's mailbox, each one bearing the foreboding heft of official government letterhead and legalese sharp enough to shave steel. Karen's face when she opened hers was something I would have paid good money to see. But the real show came later that day, when the city put the first red tags on the front doors of a dozen homes, including hers: unsafe building, unsteady foundation, immediate occupancy limitation, pending repair. In plain language, their dream homes had been found unfit to live in. I sat on my porch and watched as families stood dumbstruck in the rain, staring at the bright orange warning placards like they could not quite keep up with what was occurring. Movers' vans clogged the streets in days, engines idling as dazed homeowners struggled to recover what they could from home which had begun sinking into the ground like slow-motion wreck. Karen attempted to resist. Of course, she hired a lawyer, threatened to sue the city, screamed at the inspectors at her driveway until her voice failed, but it didn't matter. The damage was too obvious, the proof too overwhelming. The paper trail of neglect too vast to deny. The final nail had been hammered home by the insurance companies when the initial claims were received for water damage, foundation failure, and mold remediation. The adjusters swarmed like vultures and stripped the cadavers bare. Act of negligence. They asserted policy violation, failure to maintain adequate drainage structures. Denied, denied, denied. No payment, no repairs, no hope, no insurance money. The homeowners were trapped, their houses worthless, their mortgages sucking them dry. Foreclosure notices started showing up in windows like paper ghosts. Karen's own home, once the neighborhood's pride and joy with its clipped hedges and fake Greek columns, was the initial one to be outright denounced. By the end of the month, she was living in a borrowed motorhome at the rear end of the development, the wheels slowly being engulfed by the very same mud she had unleashed. The HOA disbanded disbanded not long after, at the emergency meeting held in the gutted husk of the community center. The remaining few residents voted to dissolve the organization as a whole. No fanfare, no oration, merely a simple majority risen in bitter rain. Drenched hands, Karen tried to protest, but no one even bothered to argue. She was finished and knew it. The final financial report was read in a voice so hollow it might as well have been a funeral dirge. Over $2.3 million in anticipated legal liability. Zero asset. Bankruptcy? Certain a motion was made, seconded, and voted to dissolve the HOA forthwith. Karen was last seen hauling boxes of confetti-colored shredded paper out of the community center under the watchful eye of a city marshal. But that wasn't the end, because even as the HOA came to its richly deserved demise, the neighborhood was offered a choice: try to repair the broken system the old way, or return to the land's original intelligence. The referendum to reinstate the natural drainage brought with hardly any opposition. County Environmental Department provided grants to restore the watershed. Volunteers camped out to help. Even some of the residents who were forced out of their previous homes, who previously turned me away, volunteered to give back for weeks. We shoveled, dug, and planted, revealing the concrete source to expose the dry, thirsty earth below. We rerouted the water down its original route, not with pipes and pumps and asphalt, but with stones and grasses and willow trees. The first time the creek was clear and laughing through my yard, as if an old friend were summoning my name. After many years, I sat beside it, legs dangling in the cold rush of water, and smiled as dragonflies flew back. Frogs croaked in the reed, and the ground itself breathed a sigh of relief. But I was not yet finished. On a sunny morning, when the street was alive with noises of rebuilding and renewal, I saw that, at the start of the creek, where it curves onto my land, I cut the letters myself with a whittling knife, slow and deliberate, until the message was clear and strong for all passers-by to read. Nature always prevailed. It was not spite. It was not gloating. It was truth, plain and simple, for all their rules and fine and concrete and hubris they had forgotten the oldest law of all, that no matter how high you construct your walls, no matter how much paper you sign, or how many stamps you print, you can't own the land forever. It remembers, it waits, and when the time arrives, it takes back what's its own. Karen departed the neighborhood shortly after that, dragging her battered RV in tow of a rusty old pickup truck with a cracked rear window. No going-away party, no parade, just some furtive glances and a lot of relieved sighs. The house she once dominated now stood empty, half engulfed by the very swamp she had helped create, a memorial to stupidity and hubris. The new residents who moved in never asked much about the past. They saw the new creek, the green wetlands, the healthy trees and thriving garden, and they were glad to let the land tell its own tale, a stronger tale, a lasting one. Every so often, I still find myself sitting alongside the creek, watching the water dance over the stones, listening to the frogs serenade at dusk, feeling the earth solid and sure under my feet. I follow the worn wood of the sign and smile to myself, because I know what it takes to win this peace, and I know that no matter what comes next, no matter who tries to tame it, or claim it, or redefine it, the land will endure, will remember, will triumph, just like it always has.